I'll be reading from Genesis 37:18 through 28, page 61 in your Pew Bible. "They have moved on from here," the man answered. I have heard them say, 'Let's go to Devon.' So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan." That's now starting verse 18. "But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. 'Here comes that dreamer,' they said to each other. 'Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of those cisterns and say that a furious animal devoured him. So we'll see what comes of his dreams.' When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. 'Let's not take his life,' he said. 'Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the desert, but don't lay a hand on him.' Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the richly ornamented robe that he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. Now the cistern was empty. There was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, 'What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood,' his brothers said. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt."
With our backdrop here, someone said I probably should have preached about Jonah today instead of Joseph, but I didn't think that far ahead. Last week, we read through the first part of this chapter, and we discussed the life of Joseph as it foreshadowed the life and the ministry of Jesus. And wasn't that amazing, all the correlations that we find? That was a deliberate plan of God to show us that. Well, this week I want to look at the life of Joseph in terms of how it relates to our everyday life. I think it's important then to look at Joseph's background in order to understand how this awful thing that happened to him could have possibly happened. And as we piece together some more things that happened in this very unique Hebrew family, it doesn't take too long to figure out that all was not well in Jacob's household. A popular term used by psychologists today is dysfunctional family. It always kind of makes me laugh because every family has its own little quirks and ways of doing things that may not always be the best possible way. But you run the risk of being called dysfunctional if you're not perfect in every way. Every family would be called dysfunctional if they were judged by some psychologists. However, in this case of Jacob and his boys, I feel pretty comfortable saying that this family is a case study example of a dysfunctional family. What a mess they were. And the only possible explanation for all of these problems that they had is that something was terribly wrong with how this family functioned. And while there were probably lots of different reasons for all the problems they had, I would venture to say that one of the main root causes of this whole mess could be traced to Jacob's polygamy. Polygamy is having more than one spouse. In addition to his two wives, Leah and Rachel, Jacob also fathered children by his wives' servants, Zilpah and Bilhah. Back in chapter 35, we kind of get a synopsis of how this family shaped out. It says Jacob had 12 sons. The sons of Leah, Reuben, the firstborn of Jacob, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. The sons of Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin. The sons of Rachel's maidservant Bilhah, Dan and Naphtali. And the sons of Leah's maidservant Zilpah, Gad and Asher. These were the sons of Jacob who were born to him in Paddan Aram. Now, Rachel, of course, was his wife, and the last two were born, the two youngest, and the other children were born to the maidservants, who would not have had the same social status as freeborn wives, but they were more than just concubines. It's obvious that Jacob regarded them as equal to his other wives. So in essence, he had 4 wives and children with all of them. Now, polygamy was an accepted practice back in the culture of those days, and so there isn't a big deal made about the telling of this in these Old Testament stories. But still, it was against the law of God, which specifically stated not to multiply wives unto yourself. It was not God's plan to have families this way. And in the Bible, in every case where an individual had more than one wife, it did nothing but cause problems for that person or that family, no matter how righteous he was otherwise. So polygamy is not God's way of doing things. And here is a prime example of how problems come up because of this sin. Jacob had a daughter in addition to his 12 sons, so that makes 13 children in all. 7 of them were born to Leah, 2 were born to Zilpah, 2 more of them were born to Bilhah, and then 2 more born to Rachel. And they all lived together as one big family. Is there any wonder why this family was simply plagued by the things which do nothing but tear a family apart? Things like jealousy, partiality, injustice, deception, violence, lying, greed, incidents of incest and rape, and the utter callousness of the story that Rita just read for us. Can you believe they threw Joseph into the cistern, and then they all sat down to eat their lunch? Just a loving bunch of guys, weren't they? Now, even the best of families can have a child turn out bad. Even the worst of families can have a child turn out good. Joseph, for instance. But generally speaking, when you see patterns of behavior such as are exhibited in Jacob's sons, it's safe to assume that there are problems in the family. And these are the kinds of problems to expect when a child has 4 mothers, or 3 different fathers, or 8 sets of grandparents, along with half-brothers here or stepsisters there, or live-in uncles, or mommy's boyfriend's other children. This is our society. That's what it is. It's defended by the media. It's perpetuated by Hollywood. It's accepted by a new generation. And it's not as if it's a new scenario. The same kinds of situations existed thousands of years ago, as we see in this Bible story. But these situations are a whole lot more prevalent now. Our society has moved into the 21st century, is defined by such situations. The blended family is a reality of our society. Right or wrong, like it or not, the prevalence of divorce and remarriage and children born out of wedlock has simply made the blended family a fixture of American culture. Of course, there are some families that are blended through no fault or sin of anyone. And I want you to understand that my purpose here today is not to pronounce some kind of judgment on blended families. The blended family in itself is not wrong. It's just that the reasons why most of them have come into being have caused problems. I don't think the blended family is what God intended for us. But I'm not naive enough to think that it's going to change soon, or we just got to change this pattern of society. It's not going to change. Blended families are here, and there are going to be more and more of them as the years go on. So that's the reality. That's our world. But what I want to make sure of is that we understand the right reality. The Brady Bunch was not reality. Families just don't naturally blend together. It's not natural. And even the TV shows of today, which show such families having problems and arguments, they still manage to work everything out by the end of the half hour, and thus trying to prove that blended families are wonderful. The reality is that when you blend a family, there's absolutely no way to avoid the pitfalls of that. There are pitfalls of partiality, of jealousy, injustice. They're a part of the whole package. Everyone involved in that family will have to deal with those aspects of family life. That's the reality. Now, those of you who are here today who might have blended families, please don't think I'm condemning you. You are where you need to be right now. I'm so glad that you're here. And we stand behind you as a church, and we pledge to do our best to help you to raise your families in the Lord and to teach your kids to love Jesus. However you got into your situation, that's where you are. And what you need to do now is just to move forward the best you can with the Lord's guidance. But at the same time, I don't want you to have those Brady Bunch illusions. And I don't want you to be surprised when you have to constantly deal with these issues that we're talking about here this morning. And if there's anyone who might be thinking about deserting your spouse and your current family and taking up with someone else that you think might be able to give you a better life and happier life and family, please wake up and open your eyes to the real reality. Think long and hard before you do anything that would be in disobedience to the Lord. And even if blending a family would not be in disobedience to the Lord's commandments, and it isn't always, certainly, you should still think long and hard before jumping into that. It's not an easy life. It's very complicated. We learned that from this family of centuries ago. But not only was Jacob's family damaged because of his polygamy, it was also damaged because of his passivity. A couple of the incidents that I mentioned were indeed very tragic and very traumatic to family life, as it would be to any family. Jacob's daughter Dinah had been raped. Jacob's son Reuben slept with one of his father's wives. And as tragic and awful as those things were, the most tragic thing about it all was that Jacob did nothing about any of those situations. Now, without going into all the sordid and disgusting details of each situation, just let me say that in each case, a particular point is made in Scripture. That Jacob knew about what had happened, but he said or he did little, if anything. In the case of his daughter's rape, he just let his sons handle the situation, and it turned into a brutal massacre of a whole town. You can read Genesis 34 if you want to get all the details of that story. But a point is made here is that Jacob knew about it, but he did nothing. He said nothing. In the case of the incestuous relationship between Reuben and one of his wives, the point is made in chapter 35:22 that Joseph heard about it, or Israel, which is his other name. He heard about it, but that's all that's said about it until Jacob's ready to die, and then he takes away Reuben's rights as his firstborn son. Now, families go through rough things. Every family goes through some difficult things. Some families even as difficult as these things, like rape and incest, or other horrible tragedies that can happen. And things may happen to a family that you may have no way of being able to control. But there are still things that need to be dealt with. When tragic things happen, there needs to be open communication and an opportunity, at least, for healing to take place. And as difficult as some of those things might be to have to endure, there's nothing a family cannot overcome if you deal with it. The greatest damage that can happen to a family will not be found in any tragedy, no matter how bad it is, but rather in refusing to deal with the tragedy. Many people have been coming forward with stories of abuse from their childhood, or of their getting in trouble in some way, and those problems were never dealt with in their families. And most everyone will say that the thing that hurt them most was not what happened to them, as bad as it might have been, but rather the passivity of their parents in the midst of the situation. And this is such a common thing, common story of parents who did nothing when their family was in crisis. One parent might be protecting his or her spouse, or the parents might be embarrassed about the situation, just don't want anybody to know about it, so they don't talk about it. Perhaps they didn't even care about their children, but maybe they did care, but they just didn't know how to handle the situation. And so they chose to do nothing, to say nothing, to deny, to ignore, and to pretend that nothing happened. And even if you have no idea how to handle something, and that's often the case, you don't really even know what the right thing to do is, still do something to show the people in your family that you do care. Talk about it. Get some help from outside the family if you need to. Pray with each other about it, but don't pretend nothing is wrong when it is. As I said, any problem can be dealt with. Nothing is so bad that there cannot be emotional healing. But when the ones who are supposed to be there to protect you and to care about you make you feel that you are unloved and unimportant, then you have a lifetime of resentment, of bitterness, of pain and anger. And it can't help but affect your spiritual life and growth. How Joseph turned out to be the righteous man he was is a wonder. Perhaps he got out of that household before too much damage was done. Or perhaps because he was the favored son that he was sheltered from the damage that his siblings had to endure. Or maybe by the time that he and Benjamin came around, his father learned a thing or two about parenting. I don't know. But at any rate, this dysfunctional home claimed a number of victims. And that's what happens when the family breaks down. And that's what's happening all around us. Family is breaking down, and it's causing problem after problem after problem. And for many people, it's not until they are adults and they're out of that family situation that they can even begin to deal with the damage that's been done to their souls. But the thing is, quite often, that doesn't even happen. Instead, we see another principle at work, which we see in the family life of Joseph and his father and his mothers and his brothers and sister. And that principle is that bondage leads to more bondage. It's an irony, but certainly not a coincidence, that Joseph being sold into slavery is what ultimately and directly resulted in the whole Israelite nation being in slavery for hundreds of years. One kind of bondage literally led to another kind of bondage, much more severe than the first. Israel's slavery in Egypt would not have happened if Joseph had first not been enslaved and taken to Egypt. And we see this same principle at work in family life and other types of bondage. Now, once someone in a family has been enslaved to certain repeated sins or addictions or patterns of abuse, those same patterns are repeated over and over again in that family until or unless something is done to deliberately stop them. Abused children often grow up to abuse their own children. Children of alcoholics often grow up to be alcoholics. Neglected children often grow up to neglect their own children. Premarital pregnancy is a pattern that I have seen repeated in a family time and time again. And you would think that one person might learn from the mistakes of others that have gone before him in his or her family, but more often than not, those same mistakes are repeated. Why? Because bondage leads to more bondage. If a particular pattern is all that you've known in your life, then it is a natural tendency to simply just repeat the pattern. Even if you know the behavior is wrong, even if you've told yourself, I'm not going to do that, you said you'd never repeat those patterns, I'm not going to make the same mistakes my parents did or my siblings did, it often just happens anyway. Psychologists will tell you that your early family life has a profound effect on your personality and the kind of person that you turn out to be. The habits and the mannerisms that you develop as a child stick with you for your whole life, unless you deliberately take steps to change them if you want to. The same holds true in your spiritual life. Aspects of spiritual bondage can almost always be traced to a person's childhood, to sins that they were exposed to at an early age, or to traumatic things that might have happened to them as a child. And unless you face those things as an adult, you're going to remain in bondage to them. It's ironic, but only natural, that Jacob, who his name means deceiver, and that's exactly the kind of person he was. He's known as that because he so cleverly tricked his father and his brother and wound up with the inheritance, if you remember that story. Well, Jacob the deceiver wound up being deceived by his own sons. In verse 31 of our chapter today, in 37, we read about that. It says, they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornamented robe back to their father and said, we found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe. He recognized it and said, it is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. Bondage leads to more bondage. Deception leads to more deception. The rebellion of Joseph's brothers against him had to do with a lot more than just their hatred and their jealousy of Joseph. Even more than that, it was a rebellion against that idea that Joseph was going to rule over them. Remember that part of his dream, that he dreamed that he would rule over them? And that was more than they could stomach. And so they made sure in their own minds that that would never happen. Whatever it takes, we'll kill him, we'll sell him, just get him out of our lives. But really, this was a spiritual problem as much as it was a family problem. Their rebellion was against God and what he had revealed to Joseph. And in the end, God made sure that Joseph's brothers did indeed bow down to him, just as was revealed in Joseph's dreams. But at that moment, in bowing down to Joseph, what they were really doing was demonstrating their ultimate submission to God. They were really finally taking care of their spiritual problems. They were finally facing up to the consequences of their own sin. And that was the real issue here. And we're going to get to that in the next few weeks to come. In families today, it is often mistaken as what it is that does the most damage to family life. Contrary to what many might say or think, it's not poverty that disrupts family life. It's not prolonged illness or sudden tragedies or loss of loved ones that takes the heart and soul out of a family. I mean, some people think if those things were to happen to my family, it would just destroy my whole family. But the truth is, when handled effectively, it is those very things that make a family stronger and draws them closer to each other and produces people of character and virtue. Rather, what kills families are spiritual problems. In other words, sin. It's not the disagreements that cause rifts in a family. Every family has disagreements and difficulties, but rather it's the sins that arise from those disagreements, the sins of rage and spite and malice and unkind words. It's not the circumstances of a family life that cause a spouse to commit adultery, even though often things are identified. This is why I cheated. This is what happened to make it all come about. But rather, it's the sins of lust and selfishness and vengefulness. It's not the child's behavior that drives a parent to abuse, even though they can identify those things that just drive a parent crazy. But no, it's the sins of lack of self-control and misuse of power. It's not just miscommunication that makes love grow cold in a marriage, although you can certainly identify things that have led to that, but rather it's the sins of pride and apathy and faithlessness. And while it's fine and good and important to address those outer things, those disagreements, those circumstances, that bad behavior or that miscommunication that can cause problems in a family, you do need to deal with those things. But unless you address that problem of sin and the bondage that it causes, there's nothing that you can do to stop the killing of the family, because it's the spiritual problems that kill the family. We can learn a lot from Joseph's family about family life, mostly what not to do. In a couple weeks, we'll see what this family learned themselves about healing and maturity and reconciliation. The Christian home is a mighty tool in the hands of the Lord. May we learn how to make our families more effective for use in God's kingdom. And so by relying on the Lord's guidance for His direction about, first of all, monogamous marriages, and secondly, for being actively involved in each other's lives, and by breaking the bonds of sin, then our families can be strong and helpful in our quest for spiritual maturity. And the stronger your own family is, the stronger the family of God is going to be as we try to apply these same principles to our work in the church. Perhaps you're disappointed with your family life. It's just no good. Or perhaps your childhood has damaged you in many ways. In Jesus Christ, there's always hope. There's the promise of healing and restoration for your soul, if not for your family. So I beg you to turn to Him, trust in Him, follow Him, dedicate your lives, and from this point forward, your families, to the Lord's direction. And that family can be a mighty tool in His hands. We're going to sing a song about the family. It's not a very familiar song. I really didn't know it very well, but the words are so appropriate for what we're talking about today. So you probably need to turn to your hymnal to get the melody and the songs. But as we sing it, if there's anyone who would like to devote your life to Jesus Christ, to turn it over to Him, no matter what's happened to you in your family life, in your background, you can do that today. Or to become a member of our church, you're also invited to make that decision. We're going to sing In the Circle of Each Home. You'll find it at number 566 in your hymnals. And ask you to stand together as we close in singing.